Since the Epstein files were released over the weekend, we've done segments on Peter Mandelson, Prince Andrew, Bill Gates, and Tony Blair. Not characters Novara viewers tend to have much affinity with. But in the millions of emails released from Epstein's accounts, it's not just billionaires, royalty, and Blairites who come off with their reputations damaged. Yes, leftist icon Noam Chomsky was also remarkably close with the billionaire paedophile. Now he's pictured here on his private plane. Now, the close relationship between Chomsky and Epstein has been public for a while, and the image we just showed you is part of a tranche of documents released late last year. But this latest release contains emails that show just how close the relationship was. Now, lots of these screenshotted emails I'm showing you here are from or via the journalist Anna McLeod. So where there are highlights, they're his. So these are just some emails. This is from Noam Chomsky in 2016, still eager to make it to the Caribbean. Then we can go on to the following month, which was upgraded to Chomsky really fantasizing about Epstein's Caribbean island. A year later, Chomsky's wife, Valeria, received an email saying, quote, "Thank you so very much for helping to make Jeffrey's birthday booklet even more special. He was thrilled and touched by it. Please do pass along to Noam." It's clear from these emails that Epstein and Chomsky met on multiple occasions and had a pretty close relationship. In 2015, Epstein paid for Chomsky and his wife to stay in a $1,400 a night Manhattan hotel suite. Paying back the hospitality in 2016, Chomsky informed Epstein that his wife Valeria had prepared Epstein's favorite dessert. And this is perhaps the most damning email of all. It's from 2019. So it's an email from Noam Chomsky to Jeffrey Epstein in 2019. So quite a lot had come to light by then. So he writes, "I've watched the horrible way you are being treated in the press and public. It's painful to say, but I think the best way to proceed is to ignore it. I've had plenty of experience, though of course not on this scale. A Google search will bring up tons of hysterical accusations of all sorts, even groups devoted to vilifying me. I pay no attention unless I'm approached for a comment on a specific matter. It's a nuisance, but it's the best way. The same conclusions from experiences of others, in some cases close friends. What the vultures dearly want is a public response, which then provides a public opening for an onslaught of venomous attacks, many from just publicity seekers or cranks of all sorts, which are impossible to answer. How do you prove that you are not a neo-Nazi who wants to kill the Jews, or a rapist, or whatever charges come along? That's particularly true now with the hysteria that has developed about the abuse of women, which has reached the point that even questioning a charge is a crime worse than murder. For virtually anyone who sees any of this, the reaction will be, where there's smoke, there's fire, maybe raging fire, whatever the facts, which few will even think of investigating. In general, it's best, I think, not to react unless directly questioned, particularly in the current mood, which I presume will fade away, even if not in time to prevent much torture and distress. Hard to say, but it's the best advice I can think of. No. Aaron, when we're, it's important to say, Noam Chomsky, there's no suggestion that he went to Epstein's pedo island and had sex with anyone, right? There's lots and lots of exchanges between Chomsky and Epstein where we can get quite a good idea of what the relationship was. And it seemed to be a relationship where they had developed a close friendship, where Chomsky met lots of interesting people via Epstein. Epstein enjoyed having this eminent scholar sort of as a friend. And Noam Chomsky was very defensive of Epstein, who by 2019, not only had he been convicted of procuring sex with a minor, there was also reporting in 2008 about how some of those people were as young as 14, and there were numerous people. Part of the sort of the sweet deal given to him by the prosecutor in 2008 was that the charges were somewhat ambiguous. It was procuring sex with a minor, someone under 18, which allowed lots of people to say, oh, it was probably just a 17-and-a-half-year-old, and say the reporting was just salacious, which wasn't true, of course, but that's, I think, how people justified their friendship. By 2019, a lot had come out about Jeffrey Epstein, and Noam Chomsky is still saying, essentially he thinks it's a bit of a witch hunt. Aaron, how do you respond?
Well, I think judging from that final screenshot you just read out, sort of lengthy email, it does seem like Chomsky is trying to comprehend the situation through the prism of cancel culture. And he's probably bringing his own biases and preferences to that because, of course, over the 2010s, there's this big conversation about cancel culture and what you should do to people when they err, the moral zealotry sometimes of progressives and people on the left, which Chomsky had critiqued. And I think he's applying some of those conversations to this. I also think he was just seduced by the glamour. Anybody can be. There's a great anecdote from Yanis Varoufakis where he says, once you fly on business class, you think you deserve it, right? You're flying on economy, you're on Ryanair, EasyJet, and then you fly, Air Emirates business class, a $20,000 flight, and then you have to go back to your old life and you think, hold on, I'm better than this. And that can happen to anyone. As Marx said, conditions determine consciousness. And I do think that pretty much anyone could be subject to making bad calls because of being in this reified world. I'd also say that if you're not part of a wider political movement where people cannot call you out, because I don't think that's necessarily productive, but call you in, have conversations, tie you to reality, challenge you, hold you accountable, like my colleagues do here at Novara Media, as one example, or you might get in a political party or in a business. I think if you don't have that, this kind of stuff happens more frequently. Finally, this is appalling. This is appalling, and people should make absolutely no excuses for it. But it's important to say that, Chomsky, and in a way this is added context, is in many ways the most important left-wing figure in the post-Cold War world. I remember being a 15-year-old in Bournemouth in a Borders bookshop, and you would have Noam Chomsky, Understanding Power. You could buy that book in little old Bournemouth. So this guy has been so fundamental to helping shape people's views, politics, preferences, but that doesn't take away from what's happening here. I'd also add one final point, which is he's really old. I wonder how that figures, because I've never spoken to the man. I don't know him. But did his judgment of people deteriorate with age? I have no idea. I mean, people that are closer to him will have to answer that. But I do find it supremely ironic and troubling in a way that such an intelligent man who was such an outstanding voice for left-wing and progressive causes was palling around with somebody like Jeffrey Epstein. It does help discredit the wider left. If that man hasn't got principles, do any of us? And of course, many people do.
Well, also, I suppose, does it discredit, because I think lots of people look at this through the Epstein files and everything through a partisan lens. So you see sort of Mandelson, was still willing to be friends with him after he was convicted. That's because Blairites have no morals. And so you make it about this political distinction. So it's only right-wing people, or it's only billionaire tech people who are willing to hang around with someone who's been convicted of that kind of thing. Does this make it seem like actually maybe it's not as closely aligned with politics as some people might like to think?
I think it kind of is aligned with politics, but not in its entirety. I can't imagine somebody like Mick Lynch thinking it's okay for a billionaire financier, puck the paedophile bit for a minute, even an upstanding person, to pay for his hotel suite that's $1,400. I just think certain people say, you know what, I'm a successful person in my own right, I have money, you don't need to pay for me, there's no such thing as a free lunch. I think that's quite a common sense position.
I mean, we know some trade union leaders who got quite expensive flights and hotels paid for.
Well, let's park that for a moment. But no, I think when you're as successful as Chomsky, do you really need somebody else to pay for your hotel suites? I mean, it's ridiculous, frankly. He's a very successful man. He's a grandfather. He's with his wife. Why does this man need to pay for your hotel room? It's like with Starmer getting free specs and free dresses for his wife from Lord Walid Ali. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You're a grown man, for goodness sake.
Well, as a clue, I mean, we should also say, I mean, it's unfortunate because this is all coming out while Chomsky is still alive, but seems to be incapacitated to some degree, seems to be sort of so ill that he's unable to respond. He has, though, in the previous set of files which were released, there is a sort of open letter written by Noam Chomsky vouching for Jeffrey Epstein, which I suppose also gives some insight into what Chomsky got out of the relationship, or what he thought he was getting out of the relationship. So we'll read that. So it says, "To whom it may concern, I met Jeffrey Epstein half a dozen years ago. We have been in regular contact since, with many long and often in-depth discussions about a very wide range of topics, including our own specialities and professional work, but a host of others where we have shared interests. It has been a most valuable experience for me. In the area of his own direct engagements, I have learned a great deal from him about the intricacies of the global financial system, about complex technical issues that arise in the often arcane world of finance, and about specific cases in which I have a particular interest, such as the financial situation in Saudi Arabia and current economic planning and prospects there. Jeffrey invariably turns out to be a highly reliable source with intimate knowledge and perceptive analysis, commonly going well beyond what I can find in the business press and professional journals. Turning to my own special interest in linguistics, cognitive science, and philosophy of language and mind, Jeffrey constantly raises searching questions and puts forth provocative ideas, which have repeatedly led me to rethink critical issues. It goes on. Given the range and depth of his concerns, I suppose I should not have been surprised to discover that Jeffrey has repeatedly been able to arrange, sometimes on the spot, very productive meetings with leading figures in the sciences and mathematics and global politics, people whose work and activities I had looked into, though I had never expected to meet them. Once, when we were discussing the Oslo agreements, Jeffrey picked up the phone and called the Norwegian diplomat who supervised them, leading to a lively interchange. On another occasion, Jeffrey arranged a meeting with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, whose record I had studied carefully and written about. We have our disagreements, but had a very fruitful discussion about a number of controversial matters, including one that was of particular interest to me, the TABA negotiations of January 2001, in the framework of President Clinton's parameters events that remain obscure and controversial because the diplomatic record is still mostly secret. Barak's discussion of the background was illuminating, also surprising in some ways. In very different areas, much the same was true in meetings Jeffrey arranged with evolutionary biologists, neuroscientists, mathematicians, and computer scientists. Several of them engaged in exciting work at the limits of understanding in their fields, sometimes with perspectives quite different from mine. More lively interchanges in which Jeffrey was once again an active participant, often an effective gadfly. The impact of Jeffrey's limitless curiosity, extensive knowledge, penetrating insights, and thoughtful appraisals is only heightened by his easy informality without a trace of pretentiousness. He quickly became a highly valued friend and regular source of intellectual exchange and stimulation. Let's look at what one of Chomsky's acolytes made of this letter when it was first published last year. So Glenn Greenwald is a journalist who, like Chomsky, has spent years casting a critical eye on US power and foreign policy. He says he looks up to Chomsky professionally and personally knew him well.
Chomsky's human, and we all have these temptations of money and power and the allure that it presents. It's not the case that Chomsky is typically sought after by members of this global elite. I mean, again, he's certainly someone very influential. He has a lot of friends who are, like Lula, but not this kind of global moneyed elite. So maybe he was dazzled by Jeffrey Epstein's interest in him, or he had a lot of institutional loyalty to MIT. Maybe Jeffrey Epstein's pouring money into MIT. Who knows? I don't know what to make of it. I'm just saying it must be the case that Jeffrey Epstein had some sort of interpersonal skills that were quite exceptional. I talked before about how people behave around billionaires. It's shocking. Like, people who you wouldn't think would do this. I'm not talking about people who work for them, but anybody. It's like that level of wealth and power becomes so captivating to human beings. It's one of the reasons why I think a lot of billionaires go crazy, because they can't be around people who treat them in a normal way. Everything is just constant sycophantic affirmation. But if you ever listen to Chomsky talk about oligarchs and powerful and wealthy people, he does so with this scorn and contempt that would make you think that he would be immune to that kind of courtship. But apparently not. There's no doubt he was very close friends with Jeffrey Epstein and had a great deal of respect and admiration for him.
That was Glenn Greenwald. I mean, I suppose the most sympathetic way of looking at it is that he met loads of interesting people who had been writing about, and so it sort of enhanced his understanding of the world. And I suppose you could say, well, why couldn't he have taken those introductions without all the friendly stuff? I suppose the only way you get those introductions is to do the friendly stuff. I mean, at the same time, he clearly just was good friends with Jeffrey Epstein.
I think this really underscores how expert Epstein was at finding your vulnerability as a person. Clearly, he could captivate somebody like Noam Chomsky through adding value in this manner. You get to speak to world-leading neuroscientists, the former Israeli PM, the Norwegian diplomat who was responsible for this or that negotiation regarding Israel-Palestine. And that was what Chomsky wanted. And the genius of Epstein, and clearly he was very, very smart at doing this, as was just hinted at there by Glenn, is that he could do this for anybody and everybody. Pauper and prince, literally, in the case of Prince Andrew. So that's the first point. And I think that's being very charitable to Chomsky, but it's also revealing of a broader issue with Epstein and how he managed to do what he was able to do. Secondly, though, that comment we had from a communication between Epstein and Chomsky we saw a moment ago, I'm really fantasizing about the Caribbean island. That doesn't sound like somebody who's wanting to talk to, peer-reviewed scholars and world-leading neuroscientists. That's somebody who just wants to have a nice time with a guy he really gets on with. And I'm sure, again, Epstein in many ways was captivating and fascinating. We all love to be around interesting people, actually. And you don't always have to agree with them. Some of the people I have the best conversations with, I don't agree with them. But here's where I think there's a jumping off point. And that's on that email from 2019, where Chomsky is responding to Epstein in such a way that is clearly inappropriate for all of the things that were already a matter of public record. So look, you don't need to cancel Chomsky on this. I think this reveals a broader lesson which we can all learn from. It also, I think, exposes, like I say, the genius of Epstein. But we shouldn't make excuses for somebody who sent that message on February 23rd, 2019, which was effectively diminishing sexual assault. I mean, it's a really, really serious thing, particularly for somebody with that much wisdom. I'm somebody who thinks that generally speaking, the older you get, the wiser you become. And that to me is the most striking thing here, which, I can only conclude he was really taken in by Epstein.
I suppose in terms of being consistent here, so with Peter Mandelson, clearly what we know now is that he had a very different relationship to Jeffrey Epstein than did Noam Chomsky, right? They're sort of making sexual jokes. There's clearly a sort of quid pro quo where basically Mandelson is giving him information, and that's going to be helpful for Mandelson to become very rich in the future. So from what we know now, I think these files make Mandelson look a lot worse than Noam Chomsky. However, from what we know now, what we knew about Mandelson, say, a year ago is quite similar to what we know about Noam Chomsky here. If anything, what we knew about Mandelson a year ago was better than what we know about Chomsky here because, there weren't any sort of long letters where he was explicitly defending what Epstein had done. So in terms of Keir Starmer, say, knowing that Peter Mandelson had been friends with Jeffrey Epstein after the conviction, he probably also was told, look, Jeffrey Epstein was a very interesting, engaging guy who could introduce you to interesting people. So I suppose if we're speaking sympathetically of Noam Chomsky here, should we not be more forgiving of Keir Starmer making Peter Mandelson US ambassador a year and a half ago?
Well, I think with Mandelson it's different because he does have this hinterland and this record of being somebody who repeatedly falls short when it comes to moral standards. He had to resign twice.
So you don't give him the benefit of the doubt because of that background information?
Well, quite. But again, and I think responding to what you just said there, Epstein clearly looked at individuals as assets, as resources. And of course, Mandelson was a resource because he could give him market-sensitive information while being in a position of political influence and authority, whether that was in government, as in 2008, with Brown, or maybe, as we'll potentially see going forward, as a EU Commissioner for Trade. What Chomsky was probably an asset to leverage when he wanted to impress policymakers or people in finance. Wow, you've got the MIT scholar, Noam Chomsky, one of the most cited academics, I think maybe the most cited academic in the English-speaking world ever. I could be completely wrong. He's certainly up there. I think he's top 3.
It's often said about him.
He's top 3. He's up there, right? Highly cited academic. So I think, Chomsky was still very much a resource for Epstein. And that's clearly a very flexible way of looking at people, being able to leverage them. These were chips, Michael, for Epstein. This man was a psychological expert, and I think he played these people very, very well by appealing to whatever he thought motivated them and incentivized them. But like I say, once that stuff is out in the public domain, you should not be doing that. And of course, you're right, this is kind of similar to what Mandelson was saying in terms of what was in the public domain until quite recently. But when you're seeking public office, or when you're seeking to represent a country on the diplomatic stage, as Mandelson was by seeking to become the ambassador of Britain to Washington, I think you obviously have to have a high threshold.
Yeah. Also, I think this probably would be disqualifying for giving Chomsky a significant job at this point, right? He shouldn't necessarily be... You don't have to burn his books. But once you found all of this about Chomsky, you're not making him the dean of a university, are you? And I suppose, Peter Mandelson was made the ambassador to the United States. Someone who comes off much better than Epstein in these files is Norman Finkelstein. So the context here is instructive. So I'll do some explaining. In 2015, The Guardian reported on a number of charities who were turning their backs on Jeffrey Epstein. It was at this point that accusations were surfacing against Epstein from victims like Virginia Giuffre, and charities were seeking to cut ties with the billionaire. But the article also included a defense of Epstein from Robert Trivers. Now, he's a prominent Rutgers University biologist. This is from that 2015 article in The Guardian. Did he get an easy deal? Did he buy himself a light sentence? Well, yes, probably, compared to what you or I would get. But he did get locked up, Trivers said. He said he got $40,000 from Epstein to study the relationship between knee symmetry and sprinting ability. Trivers also said he believes girls mature earlier than in the past. Quote, by the time they're 14 or 15, they're like grown women were 60 years ago. So I don't see these acts as so heinous, he said. So, I mean, this is, again, it's sort of seeing how did people justify being friends with Jeffrey Epstein or getting money from Jeffrey Epstein. This is a very, very prominent biologist at Rutgers University who in 2015 tells The Guardian that 14 and 15-year-old girls are like adults were 60 years ago. For some reason, they're aging quicker. So that's the defense of him. And in response to that, Trivers gets a very angry email and a very well-put email from another academic. This one's called Joseph R. Cheney. He says this: is this claim regarding teenage girls your scientific opinion? If so, I'd like to see the research supporting your idea that a girl of 14 is as mature emotionally and psychologically as an adult woman in the 1950s. The real problem with the statement, though, is the way in which it places blame for child abuse on the child and excuses the criminal actions of an adult sexual predator, a man who was a serial rapist of children. Your claim about 14 and 15-year-olds is clearly wrong in the legal sense, but it is also wrong and dangerous as a claim about maturity. Any parent of a teenager can tell you that teens are not like adults. They have not yet internalized a sense of authority. They still depend largely on the judgment and guidance of adults who praise them for their obedience more than for their independence of mind. This means that they are too easily impressed by and manipulated by adults, especially those whom they view as important and powerful. Teenage girls, no matter how capable of sexual activity they may be, are not yet morally responsible persons. They are a vulnerable class of people that the law rightly protects from potential predators and abusers. I believe that your affection for Jeffrey Epstein has led you to make light of his heinous crimes. That's an email to Joseph R. Cheney to Robert Trivers. So Joseph R. Cheney also comes off very, very well. I mean, the Epstein files, but I suppose I'm more interested in Norman Finkelstein because I know who he is and I know you know who he is too. So what happens next? Well, Robert Trivers at this point seems to find this pushback from Joseph R. Cheney ridiculous. And for some reason, he emails Finkelstein for support. So the email he's got from Joseph R. Cheney, he forwards to Norman Finkelstein and says, damn, I thought a heinous crime was the US invasion of Iraq 2003, or at least murder, rape and pillage. So he's looking for affirmation from Norman Finkelstein saying, isn't this guy Joseph R. Cheney being, ridiculous, making this seem like such a big deal? I suppose he knows that Norman Finkelstein is someone who's sort of against cancel culture and moralizing, so he's expecting him to back him up. In fact, what Norman Finkelstein replies is he gets a quote from the testimony of Jane Doe number 3. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz was around Epstein frequently. Dershowitz was so comfortable with the sex that was going on that he would even come and chat with Epstein while I was giving oral sex to Epstein. So that's testimony from one of the accusers. Obviously, Alan Dershowitz denies that. But then Norman Finkelstein says, my guess is if Epstein put your daughter at age 15 in such a position, you wouldn't publicly describe him as a friend and person of integrity. In fact, I would hope that you'd promptly throttle both Epstein and Dershowitz. Aaron, you've met Norman Finkelstein recently. Are you surprised that he's come off quite well in these files?
I'm not surprised in the slightest. Norman Finkelstein is an incredible person. You can't sink the think, Michael. I've always said it. And it's true, this idea, of course, yes, a young person might reach sexual maturity at a certain age, male or female. They might reach puberty at younger ages for whatever ambient reasons or biological reasons or whatever. People are getting taller over generations. You might say that for a range of issues. But if somebody said to me, hey, you know what? 14-year-old girls today are like women 60 years ago, my instinct would be, I don't want you anywhere near children. No, seriously.
Yeah,
we should check your computer hard drive. I would just presume they're a paedophile. I mean, maybe that's unfair, or they're disposed to pedophilia. That would be my kind of operating presumption. A 14-year-old is a child. I'm somebody who's 42. Personally, and look, I'm not here to judge people that do legal things, but personally, I find it strange if somebody my age is in a relationship with a young woman who's 20. I find that strange. I mean, I don't know how you have a conversation. I'm 42. I find it, slightly odd. The idea that you would have it with somebody who's 14 or 15, I can't really grasp. So I'm very much on team norm here, and I think most people, of course, are on team norm. I think as well, once you have people in your life of that age, whether it's a niece or a daughter, I mean, obviously already disgust you, but particularly as a man, I can't think of many things that are more disgusting, because in a way it's quite evasive and slippery, right? You're not saying something which is openly contemptible. You're saying, well, actually, the legal age of, sexual consent is 16 or 18, depending where you are, but really it should be 14. I just think, what's going on here? Like, what's your agenda? And like I say, I would probably only conclude that they are effectively pro-paedophile.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, those people exist, right? We had it in this country, the paedophile information exchange. People were making a quote-unquote political argument for pedophilia. I think this is kind of an extension of that.
Yeah, 'cause it's about the context, right? If you're discussing what should be the policy when teenagers have sex with teenagers, right? And should you be prosecuting a 14-year-old for having sex with a 13-year-old, whatever, then say, okay, yeah, no, people are maturing a bit quicker than they were because they're better fed now than they were in the 1950s. Relevant argument. If you're saying, should this 50-year-old be transporting this 14-year-old to his island to have sex with them? Completely irrelevant argument. The moment you start saying maybe 14-year-olds are actually grown women is the moment I think, yes, you're probably a paedophile.
But when does that become normal? I wonder what kind of circles you have to be in for that to become normal. And clearly, you said about people are looking at this through a sort of ideological lens. So they say Epstein, Mandelson, this is a problem of people on the right. I do think this is clearly a problem with people who are in elite circles. They clearly think they are different to the rest of society. You see it with Peter Thiel, some of the communications he's had with Epstein. You see it with Elon Musk just generally. I'm not suggesting Elon Musk agrees with these particular statements, but they do view themselves as quite distinct from the wider public. And I kind of think that as a warped psychology maps onto an economy which is defined by ever-increasing inequality over time. They look at other people who are perhaps different to them socially, economically, as in a way subhuman. Would he want his daughter at 14 to be sleeping with a 50-year-old man? I struggle to believe that, and if that was the case, then that child should not be in his guardianship.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not just elites. You also have grooming gangs. You have the Catholic Church, right? There are all different situations where you can effectively dehumanize an other and sort of find grotesque justifications for your own gratification. But yeah, I mean, it does seem like there is something when it comes with this much power where people
I would say the common theme with all of those is an idea that you are immune from consequences.
Yeah.
And of course, when you're very wealthy and powerful, when you have outstanding lawyers, when you have a private island to do this away from the prying eyes of the press, when you have good friends at very high levels of politics and policy and thought leadership and culture, I think that sense of immunity from consequences percolates through all of it. And I do, by the way, think that's a problem with the Labour right. I know we're not talking about that today necessarily. It's what we've been talking about yesterday and on Monday's show. But I do think Mandelson, and I'm not suggesting everybody on the Labour right is like Mandelson, this soft on paedophiles specifically, but I do think there is a sense that the Labour right as a political faction in this country's public life do generally view themselves as being exempt from consequences. And I do think a big jumping off point was Blair and Iraq. They just do not think that the consequences that apply to everyone else apply to them. And I think this was like a snowball to such an extent that, Mandelson in 2008 would have a meeting or get an email from very senior people inside government, and within minutes, it's almost like a compulsion. He couldn't wait to send it off to Epstein. And I do think that's an outgrowth of the political culture we see on the Labour right, particularly.